Hello and welcome to The Periphery from the Pulaski Institution. I'm Alan Elrod, and today I'm going to be joined by a co-host, Dr. Heather Yates. Dr. Yates is the acting director of Pulaski's program in Nativism, Nationalism, and Populism. And our guest today is Dr. Stephen Knott. We're going to be talking about a number of things with him, and Heather is going to give a fuller intro in a moment, but particular focus is going to be his book, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, and a discussion that I think is especially timely given the hearings that have just happened this week around the January 6th insurrection in terms of the relationship between the office of the presidency and populism in American politics. So without any more ado, I'm going to pitch it over to Heather, who's going to lead our conversation today, and looking forward to it. Heather.
Alan, thank you for the introduction. And I also want to thank you for pulling me in as a co-host today. And I also want to give a great deal of gratitude to our guest, Dr. Stephen Knott, who, as I mentioned earlier, feels like an old friend by now as a presidential researcher. And he has visited my presidency class virtually, of course, because we're still in the midst of the pandemic. But in the past couple of years, he has called into my class, and we've had discussions about this inflection point of crisis and the role of the executive office in this crisis, and that there is some related arcs from history to contemporary era. So let me offer just a brief introduction of our guest today, Dr. Stephen Knott, a professor of national security affairs at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He is a prolific writer on the American presidency. He has 9 books, with another one coming out on President Kennedy. But the one we are discussing today is what Alan has already told our listeners. It's titled The Lost Soul of the American Presidency. The subtitles, The Decline into Demagoguery and the Prospects for Renewal. You can find it at the University Press of Kansas. Those who know me in real life and follow me on Twitter know that I have connections to the state of Kansas and KU. So please go to the press's website and order this book. But with all joking aside, welcome, Stephen. I am so glad that you are here with us today, and thank you for giving us your time today.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Heather, and it's good to meet Alan for the first time. So I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
So this particular book is very fitting for the program at the Pulaski Institution, because this particular program, we're focusing on nativism, nationalism, populism, with an emphasis on the fact that, extreme populism and political extremism is not a facet of the past, nor is it new. There are arcs to our histories, to our nation's founding, really. And something that I want to discuss about this book and offer our listeners a little bit of a summary and an overview before we kind of dive into and dig deeper into some of the themes. But this not textbook, I'm going to refer to it as a textbook because I employ it in my class on the presidency. So apologies to the listeners out there. It's not a textbook. It is a book on presidential history, but the book and the research is a perfect tool for this moment of time. And especially if you are interested in American political history or presidential history. And if you have questions in your mind of how did we get here, Dr. Knott's book is a very good anthology of presidential history. And it shows us that, Donald Trump is not the first president to engage in some of the rhetoric and the faux top-down populism. But we have a history here of how presidents have actively engaged in taking the presidency as an office off course. And something else that I want to tell our listeners is that Knott's research is not so much a lament of what's happened to the American presidency, but it's a history. And like I've said before, I've used the word anthology that shows us that the presidential history of populism and really leaning into, in some ways, extremism and adopting nationalism predates the Trump administration. So in some, he's a symptom, right? He's not the point of origin. And Knott's work outlines this framework and approach of study in the introduction, very succinctly leaning into this notion of the cult of the American presidency. And really leans into dispelling the hero-savior myth, which we'll get into this a little bit. But the central premise here is that the American presidency has been knocked off its course and knocked off its constitutionally designed pathway. And you outline really two ways to think about the presidency: the constitutional presidency and the populist presidency, which we will spend the bulk of this time together talking about. But the constitutional presidency was abandoned really early on. Yeah. And something in my classes that I remind students and the general public is that the president is two things. It's an office and it's a person. And what I really appreciate about your research, Dr. Knott, is that you focus on how the person steps into this office and then has changed the footprint of this office. So the first question out of the gate then is how has the person as president stepped into this office, and what has these people these men so far have done to change its footprint from the constitutional presidency to the populist presidency?
Terrific opening question, Heather, and terrific summation of my book, much better than I've ever given in any of these types of events. So as terms of changing the footprint of the presidency, I tend to focus in the book on, I would say, four key figures who significantly altered the presidency. The first being Thomas Jefferson, the second being Andrew Jackson, and then the third and fourth from the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Now, look, those four men, you point out, they've so far all been men. Those four men did not necessarily agree on the role of government. For instance, certainly TR and Wilson saw a more activist role for the federal government than either Jackson or Jefferson ever would have supported. But I think they did share a belief in the wisdom of the majority, and their sort of policies and their official presidential statements and all of it were designed to sort of enhance the role of popular will in the American system, and I would argue downplay or perhaps outright dismiss the importance of the rule of law, the importance of constitutional limitations, and at least with TR and Wilson, a downplaying or a dismissal of the role of separation of powers in the American system. So those four men, I think, shared a belief in the wisdom of the public and believed that the president was uniquely situated to marshal that wisdom, if you will, and to transform American society. Again, their visions of transformation may have been different, and they were, but they were all firm believers in the wisdom of public opinion, that the majority should govern, and it was the role of the president to marshal that majority in the service of a particular vision. And in so doing, I do think, as you mentioned, Heather, they kind of pulled us away from the constitutional presidency that I see as somewhat more sympathetic to the rule of law and to the rights of minorities who may be out of step with the majority.
And this is an interesting observation to build off your comment that these four men, these presidents, believed that it was their job, or they believed in the role of the president. It was the job to marshal that majority. And that seems to run counter to a running myth, and I'm not sure how much it really is a myth, that the framers of the Constitution were suspicious of public opinion and put so many constitutional, quote unquote, I'm using air quotations, safeguards, in that document to institutionalize gatekeeping against public opinion, right? So then the question is, this creates a tension. So how much of this is a myth that the framers really were suspicious of the public? And then what changes, especially in the early republic, when a lot of these men who were president were a part of drafting this Constitution? What changes? What changes from being a framer into stepping into the president and that whole opinion about public opinion?
I think what changes, Heather, most importantly, is the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800. And those of you who know me know I suffer from Jefferson derangement syndrome. So I'll get that right out front here. But I do see Jefferson as a key figure in that founding generation, from altering the conception of the role of the president in the American system. I mean, he does refer to his election as the Revolution of 1800. I think he's absolutely right. It truly was. And Jefferson, along with a few other members of the founding generation, particularly Thomas Paine, had a kind of unbridled faith in the wisdom of the public and felt that there was really nothing to fear from public opinion. And in fact, according to Jefferson, public opinion provides the sort of energy. Jefferson's conception of an energetic executive, to borrow from Hamilton, was one rooted in public opinion. Hamilton's, in a way, was rooted more in the Constitution and in the notion that the president may, on occasion, have to check that public opinion, that the rule of law, that the presidential edict in Article 2 to take care that the laws be faithfully executed would require the president to resist public opinion. That was one of the key differences between Hamilton and Jefferson. Jefferson has this unbridled faith. He sees the president uniquely situated to view the whole, being the only nationally elected figure. And he sees, to a great extent, the role of the president to translate public opinion into public policy. And that is a dramatic change. So I don't see that myth, you refer to it, Heather, as a myth in the minds of some, that the framers were anti-majoritarian, perhaps anti-democratic. I actually think that was the case for most of them, due to their fears of the tyranny of the majority, which I think they were onto something with that. But Jefferson and certainly Thomas Paine, even further out, did not share that view. So a lot of this, I think, comes down to Jefferson and the political party that he creates, which eventually produces Andrew Jackson.
And an interesting question comes up in my mind is then who is the public? Who is the public in 1800 versus who is the public in 2022, right?
Sure.
And I think this is the crux. Now, I'm not also suggesting that we dig into originalism here and knowing the minds of the framers, but I think it's an interesting question to at least ponder, is that those in 1800 or 1795 who were not fearful of the so-called public, who were they considering the public? Were they their elite peers? Were they the equally educated peers? Or who was it? And I didn't know if you had any thoughts on
Sure.
if there's a difference in who they believe the public was in 1800 versus who we are viewing the public in terms of majoritarianism in 2022.
Sure. Certainly, even a Jefferson or perhaps even a Paine had a narrower conception of who the public was. And of course, that would have been reserved primarily for white males over the age of 21. Perhaps some of them even would have included a property qualification of some sort. I would say this for 1795 or 1800, at least in terms of the entire world scene, the American conception of the public was certainly broader than it was in some of the old aristocratic or monarchical regimes of the old world. But certainly the public that we're talking about around the age of the Revolution of 1800 is far more narrowly defined or construed than it is today. So it would take a series of amendments, a series of political agitation to sort of broaden that public base, no question. So today I would say we've certainly removed property qualifications. We've removed gender and racial distinctions, although there's certainly efforts at times to limit the impact of certain minority groups. But we have a much broader franchise today than we would have had 200 years ago, no question.
So something to me that reflecting on that expansion of the public raises, and something I'd like to probe you on maybe a little, which is,
Sure.
I think it's when we think, because your writing certainly has, I think, to a degree, a normative quality to it that it's not good a lot of times when presidents engage in this highly populist style of politics. But obviously, in our minds, if we think of anti-majoritarian politics as being good, that's the idea of, well, the public can get things wrong, and therefore we don't necessarily want leaders who just incite popular passions or follow popular whims wherever they go. At the same time, a lot of the arguments today is that the very illness in our democracy is that it's too anti-majoritarian.
Right.
So how do you kind of reconcile that tension of some of the issues, and I think the arguments are very well made, that the problems are really in the anti-majoritarian elements of our system, that in arguing that the presidency is in some ways faltered by becoming too majoritarian, that seems like a very different diagnosis than some of the other ways in which our sort of moment is discussed.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, Alan, I think without a doubt, I'm probably in a minority here in terms of my fellow scholars. I will, again, confess that right up front. I know for many of my fellow academic peers, the issue is precisely as you put it, that the real problem is the vestiges of these anti-majoritarian entities, the Electoral College, the Supreme Court, the United States Senate has become a target of a certain amount of wrath recently. So I get that. I get that I'm sort of out of step with the contention that what's needed is more democratization. Again, Heather's heard me say this before. I'm not a part of any elite. I grew up in a blue-collar family. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I grew up in a rock-solid, left-leaning, New Deal, New Frontier family. But my reading of history leads me to believe that the dangers of majoritarianism, the price that is paid by those groups who are not part of that ruling majority, is really something that one needs to be concerned about. And I see some of these framers, especially Hamilton, Washington, Madison, having, I think, a healthy concern for the possibilities of the tyranny of the majority and the price that is going to be paid by those groups who are out of step with the majority. But again, I realize I'm sort of going against the scholarly grain here. I actually think, not to push us ahead here in our discussion, but I do think part of the reason we ended up with somebody like a Donald Trump is that we've democratized the presidential selection process so much that there are no guardrails left. So you have somebody like a Trump who really showed no, perhaps, proclivity to even being a Republican, securing the Republican nomination in 2016 against the hopes of every single leader, almost every single leader in the Republican Party. And in the Democratic Party, you had Bernie Sanders, who wasn't even a member of the Democratic Party, coming this close to securing the nomination. By the way, I'm not equating Sanders with Trump. Trump's in a league of his own. But my point being that we've democratized presidential selection. We've democratized, I would say, the office itself to the point where it is rooted in a kind of unhealthy majoritarianism that presents something of a threat to those out of step with the popular will.
Well, following on that, I think this gets onto some fairly eloquent diagnoses of the Trump moment, right? Where, in fact, some of the most, frankly, piercing analysis have come from some of the people in the Never Trump movement out of the Republican politics who have said, well, Republicans maybe they're afraid of Trump, but really they're afraid of their own voters, which gets at some of what you're saying, right? That this power rests in the voters, and that kind of what we're seeing is that, even if Trump goes away, this is kind of what the base wants. They want this sort of pugilistic, forceful,
entertainer.
Yeah. And frankly, hostile politics, right? What's happened is they figured out that actually this is what the people want, and that scares them, but also they keep giving it to them.
That's right.
Sorry, I mean, Heather looks like she wants to jump in.
Well, I want to jump in here because everything that we're describing is actually summed up in chapter 10 of Steve's book, and when he references hyperdemocracy. So a term used by political scientist Hugh Hecklow that discusses this weaponized majoritarianism, labeling it or mislabeling it as participatory openness, right? So it looks like let's just call the campaign is the marketplace of ideas, right? Opens up that marketplace of ideas to even more participants, then flood that marketplace and weaponizes that marketplace, all under this idea of participatory, deliberative democracy. And I think this is kind of what we are describing. And so I'm just wanting to interject here to
Sure.
apply a little bit of context. But I also think this is definitely a place where we can, draw these arcs from presidential history to the contemporary era, because we are also living through, I think, another era of hyper-democracy where we actually have this weaponization of our discourse. And I've been leaning into the rights as weapons model a lot lately. And I think we're seeing this all over the place. We're seeing this in the last couple of weeks with the Second Amendment, with the increased mass shooting events, with the Supreme Court decisions coming down, with the pandemic, 2.5 years of weaponized public health discourse. So it's interesting to make these connections that the president has a role in creating this hyper democracy, or this. I think another point that I want to say about hyper democracy too is that the way, Steve, that you write it is that you frame it as this hyper democracy, or this participatory openness displaces constitutional elements. And I'd like you to comment a little bit about that, about how hyper democracy actually functions to displace some of the constitutional vestiges and the significance of that.
So I think the key displacement, perhaps, and Heather, you used the word deliberation a few minutes ago. I think hyperdemocracy makes deliberation next to impossible. And perhaps you see this more in Congress than within the executive branch for obvious reasons. But of course, the president is a key player in the whole legislative process. The fact that we have, I would argue, we have a system now that is so responsive to shifts in public opinion, makes compromise, makes consensus building impossible. And so the minute that any member of the Republican Party, or perhaps even the Democratic Party, engages in some type of consensus building exercise, and we'll find out, we'll perhaps see this pretty soon with this whatever gun legislation the Senate is trying to hammer out for the moment in secret. The minute that goes public, I have a feeling it's going to get torn to pieces. And I'll be shocked if it's passed, but although I'd love to see something pass. So again, I think deliberation is a casualty of this increased democratization of the process. Obviously, presidents have contributed to this. Presidents attempt to use the media to rally public support. The media is not a friend of deliberation. The media loves controversy. The media helps presidents to fire up their base. All of that leads to, I would say, just these insurmountable obstacles towards this system at the federal level being able to function. And so compromise, consensus building, anytime a member of Congress or even a president reaches across the aisle, they're going to be accused of ideological treason. And that is just an incredibly unhealthy atmosphere for a republic such as ours to try to operate in.
And something that I want to lean into is this is not new, right? Like we have historical presidents who doubled down on this tactic. And I'm thinking of Andrew Jackson. I'm just going to put it out there, thinking of Andrew Jackson. Thomas Jefferson did this just a little bit, but my interpretation of presidents using a tactic to employ the will of the people has been to leverage Congress. Yeah. And in the 19th century, that looks different than it does in the 20th century. And this also parlays into that notion of the cult of the presidency, where the president is the only elected public official that has a national constituency. And so this is why that tactic works. That's why Thomas Jefferson is the first president who kind of really leans into being the representative of the will of the people to leverage Congress. And I think that gets lost on the public in our civic education. I don't think that's really delineated clearly enough. And how that evolves from Thomas Jefferson to Andrew Jackson just 25 years later. And then
Right.
we've got this arc from Andrew Jackson to the Trump era, which I know Alan wanted to lean into a little bit. So we're going to get there. So I'm trying to set it up here, right? But I also want to pivot a little bit to talk about this cult of the presidency, where the average American now has this impression that the president really has more legislative authority, not even power, because there's a difference between that power and authority, but actually has constitutional legislative authority that he doesn't have.
Yeah.
And the president kind of has himself to blame for creating that
No question.
impression.
No question.
Right?
Yeah. No question, Heather. And of course, Woodrow Wilson is one of the key figures to sort of provide the intellectual foundation for this notion that the president, in a sense, should become the de facto leader of the House and the Senate. She is, for all practical purposes, the legislative leader of his party in the legislature itself. And so this is all part of Wilson's scheme, I would say, to undermine the notion of separation of powers. The cost of that, and again, I hate to keep jumping right to contemporary times, but I have no particular admiration for Donald Trump. In fact, none at all. But look at how he's been able to take control of the Republican Party, I would say still in both the House and the Senate, despite some of the grievous offenses that he's clearly guilty of. He still has a hold on this party in the legislative branch that is remarkably dangerous in my view. But the roots of this go back at least to Woodrow Wilson, if not beyond. So I don't know if that's at all helpful, Heather, but those are some of the thoughts that immediately popped to mind.
And shame on me for not immediately thinking of Woodrow Wilson. There's a whole lot of other stuff that I put at Wilson's door, but yes, like he is the first chief executive to assert himself as leader of the party. And he had this deep running streak of elitism and I should also be transparent, side note here, that I heavily scrutinize Woodrow Wilson. So
Sure.
but he asserts himself as lecturer in chief. He has a PhD in political science, not a very good representative of the discipline at the White House,
Sadly,
unfortunately. But yes, this is the sticking point with Wilson, among other things, that he becomes the de facto leader of the party, and then every president ever since then adopts this, and this gets deployed during midterm elections, during re-election.
Sure.
And so it's a fascinating and compelling point to scrutinize in terms of point of origin, like where this got started, right? Yeah. But to pivot a little bit on discussing this cult of the presidency, which your book does a really good job of characterizing early on in the book, and it defines it. And I'm just going to summarize a little bit here. Is that the cult of the presidency is defined as a sort of mythical, semi-mystical worship of the office, and most notably the person in the office. It takes root in the 20th century. Yeah. And by those who embrace the unconstitutional notion of presidential government. And I think that is so key, because we see this threaded throughout even the 19th century as well, too, right? Yeah. And Steve, the way you write about Andrew Jackson is wild. Like the whole cultural cult hero worship Jackson had, that subsequent presidents, some have tried to manufacture and others have not. And I'm thinking, Lincoln did not try to overtly manufacture this hero worship, but there's still hero worship nonetheless. Yeah. Donald Trump successfully managed to manufacture hero worship and has basically harnessed the power of Twitter to do that, social media. But I want to delve into this history around Andrew Jackson because it's wild. It's wild. And I'm thinking about all of the culture surrounding it, not so much his administration, but the supporters of Jackson. We had kind of this cult following of Andrew Jackson in the same way that we have in contemporary times. I'm thinking specifically, you referenced the Old Hickory Club, right? Yeah. Old Hickory is Jackson's nickname. and the Old Hickory Club. Like, so for our listeners that might not be attuned to this, what was this?
So these were grassroots organizations that popped up around the country, particularly in the 1820s when Jackson emerged as a national figure. Or actually, he emerges as a national figure after the Battle of New Orleans. This is what cements his reputation as a war hero. And Jackson's campaigns in 1824 and 28 are centered around the personality of Andrew Jackson. Prior to Jackson, I would say there's far less of that. There's just more distance put between the candidate, and I'm almost even reluctant to use that term candidate, because it's not as if any of Jackson's predecessors viewed themselves as candidates, but nonetheless, a point being that in the 1820s, this begins to change. There's a cultish aspect that surrounds the Old Hickory, that surrounds the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. He's going to be, and he's the champion of the common man, and we can get into what that actually meant, because for some common men, he sure as heck wasn't their champion. But nonetheless, there's a personalization of the presidency that somebody like a John Quincy Adams just could not match. Or actually, I should phrase it this way. John Quincy Adams refused to match it because he believed that the personalization of the presidency and the reliance on a kind of myth-making apparatus through various party presses was a danger in a republic. And John Quincy Adams viewed Andrew Jackson as a demagogue, and I think he was absolutely right. And by the way, there's a reason why Donald Trump puts Andrew Jackson's official portrait in the Oval Office, and a lot of the folks around Trump were fond of quoting Jackson and drawing comparisons between the two. So Heather, you keep referring to these arcs in American history. I think there's a clear arc between Andrew Jackson and this personalization, these cultish aspects of the presidency, and the rise of somebody like a Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's a lot, there's quite a few scholars and journalists who like to point to 1960 as the one year that really personalized the presidential personality. And I offer a counterpoint that it possibly was Andrew Jackson. And what are your comments on this observation that was Andrew Jackson the first anti-establishment candidate?
Yes, no question. That was the basic, that and his status as a war hero, his status as a tough guy who would kill you in a duel if you crossed him or insulted his wife. It's all personal qualities. It's all anti-establishment somewhere. And one of the things we haven't touched on yet today, Jackson was a great fan of conspiracy theories. And there's this thread through these various populist presidencies where they have a tendency to circulate or capitalize on the great conspiracy theories of their day. In Jackson's day, that there's some East Coast cabal controlled by the Bank of the United States that's determined to tuck it to the white farmers on the frontier and throughout the United States. So it's constant playing on personality, anti-establishmentarianism, if you want to use that word, and bolstered by the circulation of unfounded, in many cases, not always, conspiracy theories.
This actually gives me a couple things I want to dip into with what you've just said, because what's really interesting to me about it, one is it's really interesting, right? We can, like you said, with conspiracy theories, the East Coast cabal, I think we could almost at this point say there's a ton of symmetry, right, between the corrupt bargain and stop the steal, right? But one of the other really interesting things as we're talking about this, it kind of occurs to me is possibly really with the exception of Jackson's 1828 victory, so many of these people we're talking about who are these populist-oriented presidents who come into power with, on paper, large electoral victories are actually enabled by anti-majoritarian mechanisms, right? Jefferson is partly propelled by the fact that the states that most support him are given disproportional weight by the way the Constitution allocated votes thanks to slavery, right? And then Wilson benefits from this split between Taft and Roosevelt, right? And then obviously Donald Trump, who was elected himself on not even a plurality, right? An actual minority of the popular vote in 2016, right? Presidents that, despite their rhetorical appeals to populism, are actually really kind of squeaking in.
Yeah.
And I find that tension interesting itself in sort of how they resolve the fact that they arrived in office actually on much more precarious terms than their rhetoric or their sort of claims to representing the people suggest.
Yeah, terrific question, Alan. And you actually put your finger, I think, on perhaps one of the weakest points in my book, in that those presidents the three that you mentioned, Jefferson, Jackson, Trump. I mean, Jefferson does not win the election of 1800 without the Three-Fifths Compromise. John Adams defeats him in the Electoral College if the Three-Fifths Compromise had not been in place. So you are absolutely right. There are certain anti-majoritarian features that propelled those three individuals into office. And Trump, of course, losing the popular vote twice, although I'm sure he would, not sure, I know he would contest that claim, but in the first instance, winning the Electoral College. Yeah, it's a tough one for me to address. The only thing I would say, certainly in the case of Jackson and Trump, is that, and you made this comparison, Alan, they would both contest or suggest that their election defeats the mechanisms that perhaps tainted their ability to secure this overwhelming majority was due to the evil connivance of some establishment or some deep state. But yeah, I don't have, at least at the moment, Alan, a particularly good, insightful pushback on the points that you raised, because it's a very effective and insightful observation.
Well, I think then I'd be interested in sort of pursuing a division that occurs to me, interested in hearing your thoughts about if this is like a helpful way maybe to think through some of this, because it's becoming like a popular way. Honestly, it's becoming a popular way for Democrats to resolve their own internal debates in the party, which is this idea of popularism, right? Of we should do what's popular.
Yeah.
What occurs to me about that argument is it sort of gets at a kind of ontological split about like what politics is. Because to me, when I hear popularist arguments, I hear, well, the goal of politics is to try to actually achieve things, compromise, get things done. And the best way to do that is to sort of look at what's popular, not because the people are always right, but because that's an effective, pragmatic way of getting policy done, right? Whereas the populism you're talking about is more, the correctness of my politics is sourced in the fact that I am an embodiment, right, of the people, and it's less lent to compromise. But in a way, it's almost always predicated on actually a kind of weird cocktail where, because almost nothing can. No person can embody like a full list of popular policies, right? That inevitably that person's making claims to representing the people while doing things that may actually be deeply unpopular.
Yeah. No, that's nice. Yeah. Sorry.
And I'm curious about that because, like, I think these presidents you're talking about, that animating principle, regardless of whether or not they got into office on some of these sort of like institutional structures, is there, right? Every time they come up against a fight, it's always, well, I'm the embodiment of the people, therefore thwarting me is thwarting the will of the people. And it's not really about whether or not the polling or the vote totals or the whatever else reflects that. It's a more kind of spiritual.
Yes. Nicely put. And it leads to, in so many of these cases, certainly in the case of Trump, certainly in the case of Jackson, I would argue in the case of somebody like a Richard Nixon, this notion that somehow you are the leader, you are the chosen one to lead the frequently silent majority, the law-abiding, tax-paying, church-going citizen who is the backbone of America. And that gives you a kind of special grace, a special edict to perhaps on occasion flaunt the laws in the interests of these these individuals in the majority that you have this special bond with. And it's an easy step into a kind of lawlessness. And I think maybe in Trump's twisted mind, he actually thinks that the events of January 6, 2021 was a reflection of majority sentiment. I just think that it's a very thin line possessed by those presidents like a Trump, like a Nixon. I put Andrew Johnson in this category. He always compared himself to, he was somehow had this kind of bond with the toiling white lower class farmer, perhaps lower class merchants, that allowed him to take on the establishment and engage in practices that were unheard of prior to Johnson. So I'm rambling a bit here, but you got me thinking about this spiritual bond amongst those between presidents who think of themselves as the chosen one to speak for the majority, and how that opens up the door to all sorts of potential abuses of power.
I wanted to take that and then talk about a concrete situation, right? Because I'll confess, so my dislike for Jackson is rooted, but one, big John Quincy Adams fan here. Yeah, so I'm in that small club with you, where we can get together sometime and toast JQA.
There's about 8 of us in the whole country.
But I'm reminded of the Seinfeld thing, right? The Van Buren boys. Yeah. When I wrote my master's thesis on the production of national money. So one of my first times where I really started, because I grew up in the South, and my mom's from Tennessee, and Jackson was just, again, talked about in those ways. So One of my first ways of coming into contact with Jackson in a really negative way was the bank war, right? His conflict with Biddle and his opposition to that. I think that other through line is so interesting with these presidents is how they come up against the institutions of money and capitalism. And not suggesting that it's bad for presidents to want to advocate on behalf of poor people, but that a lot of their big fights are animated by this conflict with the institutions of capital.
The institutions of capital. And I would also say, Ellen, the institutions of law. I mean, let's face it, Jackson, Jefferson, FDR, I mean, their battles with the Supreme Court were the stuff of legends. And so again, if you believe that you are the designated choice of the toiling masses, and you've got 9 or 5 of 9, robed, unelected, now men and women, standing in your way, you're gonna go after them because you are, in a sense, the chosen one. Very dangerous in my view.
And Alan, to your observation about this kind of spiritual bond that presidents project onto their national constituency, it really kind of gets concentrated in their claim of a presidential mandate, right? And under the rubric of this hero savior myth that presidents and even candidates themselves internalize this hero savior myth that they alone have the tools of the Constitution, the unilateral power to make things happen, the unilateral power to pressure institutions of law, finance, the legislature, states, federalism. That supremacy clause, it can be a dangerous little pet for some of these facets that we're talking about. And I'm just, as I'm listening to this conversation, I'm thinking about how presidents have claimed mandates when technically they don't have the public support to support a claim to a mandate. Yeah. And this is also where you get into the territory of lying with statistics, and I don't want to agitate too many of my stats friends out here, but when we just take a look at the electoral maps, right? We saw this a lot with the Trump administration, right? With the proclamations of impeach this, right? And they're showing the electoral map, and it was like that doesn't show us anything. That shows us electoral votes. That doesn't show us popular votes, vote counts, whatever. but Trump's not the first person to do this, right? So
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about, and more or less just thinking out loud here about how presidents use their rhetoric to appeal to the base, using the language of, presidential mandates. They don't use the language insofar as presenting themselves as a hero savior until recently. I mean, the President Trump did have this kind of messiah framework in which he was presenting himself, aided by the evangelical base. And this is where I've done some research into that. But, Steve, this gets me thinking about how Lincoln appealed to the Constitution of creating like a sacred text of the Constitution. And I don't know if there's an arc here or if I'm just forcing something that doesn't exist.
No, I think there is. And I'm so glad, Heather, that you brought up the term mandate, because Jefferson is the first president that's going to make the case that the mandate that he was given in 1800 and 1804 does give him a kind of extraordinary authority and puts him in a superior position, perhaps, than to the other branches. And then, of course, Jackson's going to run wild with that. Lincoln does push back, I think, against this sort of mandate exceptionalism. And if you look at Lincoln's Young Men's Lyceum speech from 1838 during the Jacksonian era, Lincoln is totally put off by Jackson's personalization of the presidency, Jackson's elevation of the majority. Lincoln is a firm believer in the rule of law. I'm not necessarily saying he's an abolitionist who's out there day and night working for the abolition of slavery. No, but he sees the dangers of the tyranny of the majority, as many of the founders did. And Lincoln rejects Jacksonianism, root and branch, for its personalization, for its excessive democratization, for our opening the doors to a kind of tyranny of the majority that you see inflicted against Native Americans and against African Americans, and a kind of, the United States under Andrew Jackson changes into a very violent nation. Now, some of that perhaps is not all on Jackson, but I think he is a man of his time. I think he fuels this violence, and a lot of that violence is going to be directed against unpopular minorities, again, Native Americans or abolitionist newspaper editors who were sometimes murdered. And Lincoln is seeing all this, sees those dangers, and in that Young Men's Lyceum speech is asking for something of a return, not an entire return, but something of return to aspects of that original constitutionalism that people like Hamilton, Madison, and Washington professed.
So I want to chase you kind of further down that trail, because I've put a couple questions to you that may have been a little challenging some of the arguments, but this one I think is really very much in agreement with what you're saying, and very much I think aligns with your arguments, which is, but I'm curious your thoughts. A lot of Americans today who might identify as progressives, I think when they think about minority rule, they're really thinking about conservative white men, right? Because that's the way things have shifted now, to where when we think about these minority checks, we're focused on the fact that, a number of senators from relatively small rural white states can block legislation. And we think about the fact that today, a majority of Americans support things like same-sex marriage or all kinds of fairly socially liberal positions that we want to see protected in law, et cetera, and then attached to minorities. But that's a very recent phenomenon. Yeah. And the broader scope of American history is that checking the majority is actually much more about protecting these marginalized groups. It's only been in the last decade and a half that some of these very liberal social positions, ideas of protecting and advancing rights have become so deeply majoritarian. And the other question to me so one, just your thoughts on that, but then the question this puts in my mind that I'm curious if it's a fair way to understand some of your case, which is, I think some of what you're saying really punctures the idea of history as progress, that we can't just trust, each successive generation to get it a little bit better than the next. Because like you said, Jackson is a man of his time. He's not enacting this violence purely because he himself is terrible and most Americans are saying, oh, I wish he wouldn't do that. No, he's a man that meets the moment in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if and that's somewhat of a dark question, but I think it does raise the question of, a lot of times I think people living in modern liberal democracies tend to think of not only is history progress, but our society is proof of history's progress.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what you lay out really questions that.
It does, Alan. And I don't know if it's a result of my dark New England Puritan upbringing, but that was a failed attempt at humor. I'm actually not. No, thank you.
I'm over here laughing, so I thought.
Okay, good. One of the things I admire about somebody like Hamilton, for instance, is he did not share Jefferson's belief and a lot of Enlightenment thinkers' belief in the perfectibility of man. Jefferson definitely believed, I think, that the arc of history was bending towards justice. I think a lot of Enlightenment thinkers shared that view. Hamilton did not, and I've got to say that I did not. I do not, and the fact is, you detected that in my book, and you're right on target to detect that. This is going to sound incredibly pessimistic, but I do think we are, and I hate to say this because I have a young granddaughter who's just shy of 2 years old. I'm deeply concerned about the country that she's going to grow up in. And I do think we are at a dangerous point. We are at a tipping point. Having said that, I don't share in the view of the perfectibility of man. I don't believe that the arc of history is sort of destined towards a more just political order. I do, I guess I would say, know enough of American history that there are the occasional bright moments, and I try, again, to focus on those moments. I do mention some presidents in this book who I think, and John Quincy Adams is one of those figures. William Howard Taft, believe it or not, is one of those figures as well, in that he pursued progressive policies. He brought more conservation land under federal control than Teddy Roosevelt did. He brought more antitrust suits during his 4 years in office than TR did, but he did not trash the Constitution. He did not trash the rule of law. And I do think TR and Wilson at times come very close to doing that. And that's where I see the dangers. So there are some bright points in American history. Clearly, Abraham Lincoln, in my view, represents one of those bright epochs, his presidency. But there's nothing predestined about this. It requires hard work. It requires sacrifice. And it requires, I think, just repeated warnings about the frail nature of the rule of law, the frail nature, the frail status of our Constitution. And that is being tested right now. And that deeply concerns me. Those of us who are concerned need to get out there and fight for what's right.
And that punctuates the last chapter of the book that you outline the prospects for renewal, right?
Yes. Because my publisher insisted, Heather, that I add an optimistic chapter.
Right. So
I got to be honest.
And I want our listeners to understand that in this book, yes, there are chapters where you outline the presidents who took the office off course, who completely altered the landscape in a negative way. But at the same time, in that last chapter, punctuating the fact that this is an ongoing experiment of self-governance and the emphasis on self-governing. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with individuals who have taken the Constitution for granted, that these institutions will remain intact in the order in which they were drafted, and it requires nothing of us, right? So there's big obligation, which this is a conversation that I left with an impression a decade ago, and here we are in 2022 with the warnings manifesting, right? And I also think, to reading the book in our conversation today, and maybe it's just because we're being primed by the era and the times that we're living through, and that it's easier to kind of beat up on the culprits in history that we can point to and say, this is where, in Jackson's administration, Jefferson's administration, and point out where it went off the rails. But something that I appreciate about this book is that there's also good presidents too that you scrutinize. And I'm going to be very transparent. One of my presidents I appreciate, Harry Truman, right? He gets some treatment in your book, right? But I think it's also a good practice to turn our attention to the presidents that we like, that you also address in this book. You do address John Quincy Adams. Alan, I'm going to out you. I know that you like Jimmy Carter. I do too. Jimmy Carter. I'm a Jimmy Carter fan. He's He may not have been a great president, but that wasn't because he wasn't a good human.
Correct.
Right. And I think that's the distinction between recognizing the office and recognizing the person in the office, which sometimes in the average citizen's mind gets conflated.
Yeah.
And so
excellent points.
I think we can pivot a little, maybe talk about the presidents we do like. And we want to kind of maybe shift.
I'm more than happy to talk about John. Not enough people talk about John Quincy Adams.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Alan.
Quincy Adams, and I know Alan and I have another
Adams than the other Adams.
And I know, Alan, we also have mutual admiration for Ulysses S. Grant.
We do.
And I have
Absolutely
appreciation,
true.
Steve, for your work on Grant in this book, because I feel like you rehabilitate him a little bit. And
Thank you.
Wanted to know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. I for whatever reason, I forget about the fact that I do have a couple of pages in there about Grant as just a startling contrast to Andrew Johnson, who I see as one of our worst presidents, one of our most destructive presidents, one of our most overtly racist presidents. Grant, part of the reason Grant was held in such low esteem for a good part of the 20th and into the 21st century is because a group of lost cause historians decided that it was in their interest to trash Grant as a president. And they're the ones who harp on the alcoholism, which was true, and harp on the corruption, which was also true. But there were aspects of Grant's presidency that I think all of us can celebrate, including a fairly vigorous persecution and prosecution of the Ku Klux Klan, at least during his first term, and a pursuit of civil rights. I mean, he had an attorney general by the name of Amos Ackerman, who should be more of a household name in American history for his progressive views on race and for his vigorous enforcement of protection of the newly freed slaves. None of this is known, in part, again, due to the hold that lost cause historians had on American history for decades, if not centuries. So there are some bright lights discussed in this book. Grant, Adams, I would include Taft in that mix. I even have a few positive things to say about Eisenhower, not so much on civil rights, where I think he was found to be wanting, but in terms of presidential style that a lot of his successors ignored and I think could have benefited from. Let me say one more thing, Heather. You mentioned the public, you mentioned just some of this being on all of us as citizens in the year 2022. I do try to conclude the book by saying that so much of this lost soul aspect of the presidency is on us, is on the American public. We're the ones who have bought into these inflated expectations that have been set by many American presidents. We're the ones at times, not necessarily the three of us, but at times have bought into populist appeals that were directed against groups that we perhaps didn't necessarily have a fond opinion of. This is ultimately on us. And if we're going to straighten out the American presidency, if we're going to restore the lost soul of the American presidency, if we're going to restore the American Constitution, it's going to have to come from us. And so I do try to conclude that book with an appeal of that sort, and I hope the folks who read it respond accordingly.
Yeah, I guess we're kind of moving towards sort of this here at the end here where we're kind of reflecting on everything. I do think there is a and again, you can tell me if this is if I'm putting a false impression onto your work. I do think there's a in contrast to some of the other arguments that I hear that are made about sort of, I don't know if I want to call what you're saying constitutional conservatism, but I do think there's a strong argument that what you're doing here is making the case for how there is a deeply liberal aspect to preserving these constitutional checks and to trying to resist populism. That actually it's something that can be done very much in defense of liberal principles and in defense of liberal values, and is not necessarily purely a conservative endeavor. In fact, it's one that very much is about respecting the rights of people, respecting the rights and dignities of marginalized groups. Tell me if that is a fair.
No, Alan, I mean, once again, you have put it better than I've put it in the last hour or so. That is exactly where I'm coming from. And I wish I could be as eloquent as you in terms of summing it up. This book and my forthcoming book on President Kennedy are, to a great extent, they are a response to contemporary politics, particularly to Trumpism. And I'm trying to convince both my liberal and conservative friends that I believe this system that we, all of us, inherited is worth preserving. And you put it quite eloquently. I believe that a constitutional republicanism as seen in the United States can work for the benefit of all Americans, including minorities, political, economic, religion, whatever, racial minorities. And I think that's a system worth preserving. And that's what my book, all of my books, at least in recent times, are about.
I think that's kind of a perfect stop, unless you have do you want to hop in, Heather?
I just wanted to hop in really quickly on the point of how we're using the term liberalism, classical liberalism.
Right.
I don't think it's appreciated enough in public discourse. Yeah. That when we're talking about classic liberalism, we're talking about the theory of liberalism, of self-governance. Yeah. We're talking classically the John Locke's second treatise of government, right? Rather than ideologically what republicanism is and what liberalism is. And I think more recently, those terms have been hijacked by political discourse. Speaking of populism, some of that weaponized language. And this is a point that I always try to punctuate, even in the classroom with my students, to understand the language that we're using is that the American constitutional experiment, the ongoing experiment, that document, is a product of classic liberalism. The Republic is part of liberalism and what that actually really means versus ideologically. And so I just wanted to punctuate our discussion today with that as well, is that we're leaning into the theory of liberalism, of self-governance, and that we all have a responsibility, bear a responsibility to cultivate this, to hand it off.
Thank you, Heather. Again, well put. Could I hire the both of you to be my spokesperson? Handle my marketing for me?
Done.
No, you guys are terrific. Your questions were all smart and insightful, and I thoroughly enjoyed this.
I am really glad, Heather, that you made the comment about liberalism in that context, because so much of that is what Pulaski is rooted in, as a kind of both modern but also classical liberalism, but certainly even the way liberalism has evolved as a thinking about freedom and responsibility and equality over the time. Do you have a last question for you, Dr. Knott? This is more of the fun question we end on, which is because Pulaski is all about these connections between the wider world and very localized things. I always ask the guests we have to name it can be a town, it can be a museum, it can be a restaurant, a thing or a place, either where they're from originally or where they live now, that is a little bit maybe off the beaten path, that if someone came to your neck of the woods, you would say, you've got to go there. You've got to experience this to really get to know my place.
So I'm speaking to you today from Canton, Massachusetts, which is about 20 or so miles outside of downtown Boston. Canton is where Paul Revere, after his famous ride, settled in and built a business that provided weaponry and other goods for the early republic. A lot of federal contracts were given to Paul Revere here in Canton. So first I would take a visitor about a half a mile from my house to Revere's old foundry site. And then we'd get in my car and drive 10 or 12 miles over to Quincy, Massachusetts. In fact, Alan and Heather, you would both enjoy this. And we would go to John Quincy Adams's birthplace, and we would go to John Adams's home. And we would see in Quincy Center, in the Congregational Church, we would go and visit the grave sites of both John Quincy Adams and his wife, Louisa, and John and Abigail Adams. They're all buried together in this mausoleum in the basement of the Congregational Church in Quincy. That's all within like 20 or 25 minutes of where I live. So I welcome all of you guys and all of your listeners to come and pay me a visit. And that's where I'll take you, to the Paul Revere Foundry in Canton, and then over to the Quincy and John Adams birthplaces and National Historic Sites.
That sounds like a great day.
I'm sold.
Thank you.
Great.
Well, I mean, you don't have to sign off to me, but I'm going to go ahead and say thank you so much for coming. This has been a wonderful time. The Periphery is a production of the Pulaski Institution. I've been your host, Alan Elrod. Our music was written, recorded, and produced by Brandon Ragsdale and Cody Smith. Thank you for coming, and please join us next time.